And today, as promised, we're talking about the Old West. Man, have we heard all kinds of stories about this, right? Of course the Old West must have been a violent place. Of course it must have been a place where life and property were insecure. It must have been because there was little to no government there. We all know that the guarantor of civilized life is the government. And yet, the truth is exactly the opposite. That in fact there was far less violence in the Old West than we thought. And in fact, people figured out ways to establish property rights in land and other things and resolve disputes and, in other words, carry out so many of the functions that we associate with government. People thrown into this sort of situation where you have all kinds of people grasping at wealth and you would think there'd be no way they could cooperate, and yet they did. My guest today is P.J. Hill. Professor Hill is Professor Emeritus, George F. Bennett Professor Emeritus of Economics at Wheaton College. He is a senior fellow at the Property and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. And it's my great pleasure to welcome P.J. Hill. Thanks so much for being here today.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right, so this book, which I just mentioned, The Not So Wild Wild West, published by Stanford, it really changes the way everybody thinks about the Old West. And yet, I would say the origins of this book almost surely are an article that you co-authored in the Journal of Libertarian Studies back in, the late 70s?
Right. That took us a long time to write the book, after some 30 years after doing more work, but it does go back to that article. You might be interested to note that we wrote that article partially because of our interaction with David Friedman, whom you recently had on, and we called at that point we called our work on the American West a case for anarcho-capitalism. I'm not sure if we would still use quite that argument, but it's really for a lot of decentralized control.
Well, before we get into some of the details, it seems that there's also been a consensus among scholars of the Old West that our view of the amount of violence that existed at that time simply has to be scaled down. Is that your understanding of the literature?
Oh, certainly is. Because it's made good press, good pulp novels, good movies, we really see the West as just a case of unending violence. I'd be interested to note that from 1850 through 1890 in all of the western states, the best we can find was that there was less than a dozen bank robberies. Now, that's over 40 years in a whole bunch of states. Well, you'd think there must be one every couple of days if you look at the movies or look at TV shows.
It's interesting. I mean, I understand how the dime novels get started. People want to sell books that are interesting and titillating for the public, but how did Hollywood, well, here I say this, should be more cynical, how did Hollywood latch onto this? Of course, we expect Hollywood to be truthful and right, stick to the script, right? But I mean, I wonder, how did that take off? Like, how did we get this so wrong for so long?
Well, I think part of it was that, it's kind of the bad news sells sort of a thing, so violence oftentimes sells. The other thing is I think people find it difficult to understand how, in the absence of formal government, people would organize themselves in a way that would be relatively orderly, relatively peaceful. So we say, look, we've got 30 or 40 or 50 years of life on the frontier. The federal government has almost no presence. The states are just being organized. And so what would you say? Well, surely this must be a case where violence prevails. And it turns out that wasn't the case.
And, of course, it seems that these particular circumstances were especially likely to foster violence because you have people who, many of whom have no intention of laying down roots there. They're going to go and make their wealth and then leave, so you don't have the sort of community camaraderie. You have people of all different ethnic and national backgrounds, people coming from as far away as China to settle there. You would think this is just going to be an absolute nightmare. Like, there are a lot of people who would think without formal government, any situation would be a nightmare, but certainly this one. So how did you ever... I guess my primary question to get started is, how did you first begin to ask yourself if maybe there was more to this story than we had been led to believe? Like, why didn't you just go ahead and accept the standard view about the Old West?
Well, part of it is I grew up on the West, and my mother was one of the very first children born in eastern Montana, and her stories about, of course, that would have been just at the turn of the century, but her stories about life there was that it was a relatively peaceful, you could almost say, cultured, civilized way of living. And so that fascinated me, and then just started doing more reading of original resources. You read the stories about, the diaries that cowboys kept as they trailed cattle north. You look at records on what happened on wagon trains. You look at what happened in mining camps. And you're right, in each one of these situations, there were valuable resources. People were armed. You would think that they would be competing for those resources by trying to shoot each other. Turned out most of the time that that's not what they did.
You have a chapter here which is a little bit different from some of the themes we're going to talk about for the most part, but this chapter on property rights in Indian country, I think just that title would be a bit shocking to some people because we've been sort of led to believe that the Indians, who are portrayed to us normally as one homogeneous blob, the Indians had no conception of property. And it's your view that to the contrary, not only did they have a conception of property, but they used that conception in ways that were conservationist and that were good for the environment in the long run.
Right. Basically, whenever resources were scarce and there was competition for them, they decided it probably made sense to form property rights. Now, among the nomadic tribes that were moving around a lot, they didn't necessarily have kind of well-defined property rights in land, and it's from looking at that the myth that the Indians had no property rights comes from, I think. But if you look at other sorts of situations, you look at Indians in the Pacific Northwest, they pretty clearly established property rights to the salmon spawning streams. Once the Indian got the horse, they clearly had property rights to their horses, and they even had a rental market in horses. A good buffalo hunting horse would be rented to a person who had the best abilities to ride through herds of buffalo and try to take one of them.
Now, suppose we're imagining people who are settling out in the Old West and maybe hoping to make their fortunes. There are certain sort of law and order type things that need to be done. You would need to establish some system for designating that this is my land and that's yours, or there are other issues we can get into later, like water rights and so on. How did they do that? How did they perform this basic function that we associate with government when, as you say, there was a very light to trivial federal presence, there was no organized state government at that point? Then how did this most fundamental function of government get carried out?
Basically, there was an agreement, and I don't know exactly how it first got started, but for instance, in a mining camp, they would decide what the size of a claim should be. And maybe it would be the first 2 or 3 or 4 people that would be there, the first dozen the people that would be there. So they would and they oftentimes wrote them down so people could see them, about how big would a claim be. And it was oftentimes how much one person could work easily. And I think the basic reason was they discovered pretty quickly that fighting, particularly when some people are armed, is pretty expensive, and it's a lot better to try to get along. So I think fairly quickly they said, let's see if we can't decide, you own this chunk, I own that chunk. We'll establish some rules about how you define your property rights. You have to drive a stake in. Now, it wasn't the case that a person could just claim all up and down a stream and take anything they wanted to. The claims were limited, maybe you would want to call that government. If it is, it's a very weak sort of a government, but at least there's an enforcement mechanism, and they did agree upon what a person could own.
Now, what do you mean? You have a chapter called Wagon Train Governments. Mm-hmm. What are these wagon train governments, and how would they compare to governments we're familiar with today, not in the Old West?
Yeah. A lot of it, again, occurs because there's so much potential for violence. You've got this huge number of people. Between 1840 and 1860, about 300,000 people make their way across the Great Plains. They're trying to get to the California gold strikes after 1848, or they're trying to settle in Oregon. And so these people are coming together. Sometimes they know each other, sometimes they don't. Jumping off points were usually somewhere in Missouri, say St. Joseph, Missouri, so they'd form a wagon train of, say, 50 to 60 wagons. They'd find a wagon master. And again, it would appear that it would be pretty hard to get all of that organized. But they did form a government, and they actually, we call it a local government. They wrote wagon train constitutions almost, and so that was the agreement. I think the difference between that and what we think of as government today is it was very small, on a very small scale, and the cost of exit was pretty low. If you didn't like a wagon train, you could leave and go to another one. And just that cost of exit meant that government couldn't be as predatory as it oftentimes is when government gets big.